When you hear Mamdani talking about the city built on immigration, that is a speech that Keir Starmer could equally have given, right? He could have given that in the first few months. To be fair, I think we've heard Sadiq Khan give that kind of speech. But from Starmer, we heard the whole thing about the island of strangers.
Hope is a more powerful force than fear. So throughout the campaign, he had to contend with lots of attacks on his character, his faith as a Muslim in public life. No shortage of that challenge here in Britain, I'm afraid, too. And he withstood those attacks.
New York will remain a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, powered by immigrants, and as of tonight, led by an immigrant.
It's John.
It's Emily. And I guess the first thing we have to say about Mamdani is he was incredibly lucky in the race he fought. A Republican candidate who barely got 7%, whose name recognition was pretty small, even amongst Americans, and a disgraced former Democratic governor, Andrew Cuomo, who had already lost the party's support over sexual harassment allegations some years ago. So in a way, Mamdani had the field to himself. But nevertheless, I think his victory was quite astonishing in terms of the turnout, more than 2 million voters, and in terms of the way he managed the messaging. He was not scared of the voter. He was not scared of his own policies. He knew what he wanted to say, and he delivered that message to them.
We've seen a politics, dare I say, since Rishi Sunak took over in Britain, where frankly there hasn't been an ounce of charisma to go around among any of them. Now, you can say that's probably a good thing. We've had too many big personalities in politics. But equally, you do need people who can communicate, who've got a sense of authenticity, who've got relatability, who've got an energy, a passion, a drive, who can somehow enthuse and make people feel that there is a bit of hope out there. And I'm just so struck by Mamdani, where look, I don't buy into a lot of the policies, and who knows whether it's going to work and whether he'll succeed, and whether people will end up disillusioned again. But he fired people up with an idea that politics can make a difference. And I kind of look at so much of what we're seeing now in British politics, whether it was under Sunak or whether it's now under Starmer, and you just think it is so underpowered. It is so sort of apologetic and weak-willed and kind of, well, we're doing our best and it's very tough. And I just think, actually, there is something maybe that we can look at New York and think, is this applicable to us?
Yeah, if you've just woken up to this result and you want the sort of beginner's guide to Mamdani, let's try and encapsulate a little bit of what he stands for. He's only 34 years old. He's Ugandan born. In other words, he can't ever stand for the US president because he was born outside of America. But he is a New Yorker and he comes from a democratic socialist position. He's been an assemblyman for the last few years, so he knows the city. He's fought for Democrats in the city from in the New York Assembly, and he comes with some very clear, easy to describe policies. He wants free childcare for New Yorkers. He wants free buses for New Yorkers. He wants to have 5 grocery stores that are essentially government subsidised to make ordinary everyday goods shopping much cheaper for New Yorkers. He is aiming his whole philosophy at the kind of immigrant class of New Yorker who has to commute 2.5 hours because they can't afford to live in the city that they would call home. So he's introducing, he says, rent freezes on New York property. In other words, his whole shtick has been about affordability. How can I make this city affordable for ordinary Americans again? And it's something that Donald Trump actually has not been able to do in the last year. He hasn't brought prices down. He hasn't really made many ordinary Americans feel they can afford these costly cities. And Mamdani posted just before his win a video of himself on a street corner a year ago, holding up a sign saying, "Come and talk to me. I want to talk about politics. I want to hear your problems. Come and talk to me." And nobody went to talk to him. There's just a sort of very lonely figure. He's sort of looking slightly lost on this sort of New York street corner. And a year later, he has become the magnet for people who say, what could politics look like if it was energised, if it was not about the rich, if it was about a different form of communication, and if it was something that embraced all the minorities, all the differences that Trump and his administration have made clear they despise.
Look, you said something really important about the number of people who voted for Mamdani in this New York election, because the numbers are huge. And what he did, where he succeeded, and look, New York isn't, you can't say, oh, well, because it happened in New York, it could happen in Doncaster or Hartlepool or anywhere else you care to mention. But he did engage young people. And so often in politics, you kind of hold to the truism, well, it's all very well going after the youth vote, but they never turn out to vote. So much better to gear all your policies to old people, because you can depend on them always trotting along to the polling station, or Zimmer framing themselves along to the polling station. Well, Mamdani has, shown that you can get young people out to vote. And I think that kind of talks to a generational thing as well, that, undoubtedly in this country right now, in Britain, there is a super serving of the boomer generation, my generation, where, there are triple locks on pensions and there's all this stuff that is there to help older people. And if you're young and you're renting, or you're young and in employment, but you don't have much of a work guarantee, then life is pretty tough. Yeah. And I think that this shows, again, a way of doing politics that is differently. And it's not just about progressive politics. It's also about a way of communicating that gets people's attention. I mean, look, in this country, you've arguably got Nigel Farage, who's very good at getting attention, and Zach Polanski, who's very good at getting attention. I'm not sure who else I'd put into that category. And so you kind of look at what's happening in New York and think, is there something we can all learn here?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of our politics at the moment is almost like memo to self. How can I go out and say nothing? How can I go out and not make a headline? How can I go out and not answer the question? How can I go out and emerge from this interview unscathed?
By speaking in a word salad, by kind of meaningless platitudes.
We talked, didn't we? We talked about Rachel Reeves yesterday, who set up this elaborate game whereby she wants to tell the public what she's going to do, but she won't actually tell the public what she's going to do. So she gets the journalists of Westminster to ask questions saying, will you raise taxes? And then she says, oh, well, that's not for today. It's for 3 weeks' time. In other words, the convolutions of language are, I think, partly what makes people feel so confused about what our politicians are actually trying to say. And earlier today, we heard Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary. Now, fair enough, she wants to go on. She wants to talk about kids and the reset to GCSEs, and she wants to talk about Britain, and she wants to talk about the schooling system. But there is a moment where she's asked on Sky News what she makes of the Mamdani win. The victory has just come through in the early hours of this morning, and this is her response.
I'll be honest, I don't follow American politics especially closely. I've seen a bit of it online, but he's clearly fought a good campaign if he's managed to secure such support.
Do you really not follow it closely?
No, genuinely. I'll follow the big stories, but not especially.
I mean, some people might say this is quite a big story, though, right? He's the New York mayor.
No, it's a big story. I mean, I'll follow, the activities of the US government. I'll follow what President Trump has to say, but no, I've got. Yeah, as we'll probably come on to talk about. I've got quite a lot to be getting on with.
I got that.
So, yeah, it sounded, I'm a great admirer of Bridget Phillipson, but it sounded so lame in some ways that, if you're going to be there on TV and you know that there's going to have been a big story overnight, do I believe that she hasn't followed at all what has happened? If you're really interested in politics, if politics runs through your veins, you'll have been following what's happened in New York and you'll know what the significance was. But it's that thing, Emily, you were just talking about a moment ago. I don't want to give a headline on something else. I just want to stick to my lane. I want to, I've got my message. I'm going to stick to my talking points. I'm never going to stray outside them. And I just think that people, I think it's a turn-off.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be sympathetic to, an education secretary who wants to talk about education. But nobody would say that about Trump right now. Nobody would say, oh, I haven't really followed what's been going on in America. Oh, I haven't really followed what's been going on with the tariffs. Oh, I haven't really followed what's been going on, with Donald Trump and the sort of locking up of university students or whatever. And actually, the point about Mamdani is he is now taking the fight from progressives, from Democrats to Trump. So for no other reason watch what he's doing, because actually that could be a really important thing to learn.
I would love our politicians, and maybe this is to be more courageous, to be. Why don't you say what you think? Tell us what you is. And I know the risks. I know the pitfalls. I know that if you come on and say, well, of course the government's made a mess of this, there may be a headline saying government split over whatever policy it happens to be. But I think the public now are sufficiently sophisticated to know when they're being bullshat, if that is the past tense.
I love that.
Yeah?
Yep.
When they are being bullshat, and when they're telling the truth, or when they're expressing genuine opinion. And I think that so much of communication strategy, and people who do media training, is not how you score a goal, but how you stop letting a goal in.
It's the Jeffrey boycott.
Yeah, dead
defense.
bat.
Yeah.
Over, start again, the next over. And I think that is something that is corroding politics, and it's just making people. It's when people hear politicians like, I mean, we were pretty tough on Rachel Reeves yesterday, but I think people hear that and they think, oh, for God's sake, what are you trying to tell me?
What are you trying to tell me? I mean, I think it goes back to, for example, when you hear Mamdani talking about the city built on immigration, that is a speech that Keir Starmer could equally have given, right? He could have given that in the first few months. To be fair, I think we've heard Sadiq Khan give that kind of speech. But from Starmer, we heard the whole thing about the island of strangers. And then we heard a rowback from the island of strangers. And then he sort of seemed to suggest that, yes, that immigration is the most important issue that you could possibly deal with. And we haven't really heard anything that suggests that probably immigration is one of many issues that needs putting in context for how you get an economy working again. So in other words, you can't really follow a line, I think, of what he thinks. Now, Mamdani, and I think we have to be honest about it, lots of people will hate Mamdani's policies, right? They will absolutely fear what he's going to do to the costs, what he's going to do to, the rising sort of welfare bill, what he's going to do in terms of the promises that he may not be able to meet. Is it really a good idea to keep, rent freezes on? There are many New Yorkers who think that's absolutely the death knell for the entire, city that sort of has capitalism in its DNA. But since his win, what is really odd is the number of city voices who are now coming out and saying, we might not like this, but we admire what he's suggesting. We've actually got to work with him. We'll help him, right? Because they've seen the turnout and they've seen the energy and they've seen how many young people have been queuing round the block just to get to vote. And so, in other words, I guess what we're saying is something really simple, which is choose a lane and celebrate it. Don't split between your lanes because you're so scared of offending Farage one day and you're scared of offending the left of your party the next. Like, just choose your lane and say, this is what I genuinely believe. It might go wrong, but I'm just going to go for it, because that's the way that we can test our politics in this day and age. We can see if these ideas work, if they're provable.
Well, let's speak now. Well, in a moment, Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, one of the government's most effective communicators, on what he thinks the lessons are from Mamdani's victory last night.
Well, we're joined, as promised, by the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, one of the Labour frontbench, the government, who was watching what was happening in New York overnight. And the tweet you put out, Wes, suggested that there are lessons for progressives to learn. What are those?
So you've got to learn the right lessons and not just assume you can transfer one campaign across to any other campaign in any country or part of the country. And bear in mind, this is kind of liberal New York City. But I think there are a few things that struck me following Mamdani's campaign all the way through. The first is that authenticity is the most powerful currency in politics at the moment. I think there's such a lack of trust in politics and politicians that that authenticity that he showed throughout the campaign really, really matters. The second is that hope is a more powerful force than fear. So throughout the campaign, he had to contend with lots of attacks on his character, his faith as a Muslim in public life. No shortage of that challenge here in Britain, I'm afraid, too. And he withstood those attacks and actually, in some ways, hung a lantern on the issues that he was going to be attacked on. So he was standing proudly as a Muslim candidate. He's quite unusual as a Democrat in that he stood as a democratic socialist. And it's a sort of reminder that the Labour Party and the Democrats, we've got lots in common, but we are fundamentally quite different in terms of where we sit on the political spectrum, because I and every other Labour Party member have the words Democratic Socialist on the back of our membership cards. Very unusual to see a Democrat, let alone a successful one, to describe themselves quite clearly as a Democratic Socialist. And so he turned what could have been a weakness into a strength. He didn't allow himself to be on the back foot when attacked by Cuomo and indeed President and the Republican Party.
So let me
and
just
then,
take
and
that.
The third one, because I think this is absolutely applicable to the UK right now. Ruthless message discipline on cost of living. Constant focus on it. It was part of every single bit of digital output I saw, and was at the heart of his policy offer. And that is a really big issue for us here in the UK at the moment as well. So I think those are the sorts of things that we ought to be looking at, and progressives internationally will be looking at.
Okay, so you have said that obviously the electorates are very different, the geography is very different, every election's its own one. But let's go back to your first thought about authenticity. When you look at government now, when you look at your colleagues now, who do you think is not being authentic enough in the way that they speak to the electorate, in the way they actually deliver their message? Because you're right, we are at a crisis of trust now. We had the Chancellor go out yesterday, not to put too fine a point on it, to tell people that bad news was coming, but she wouldn't tell us what the bad news was. And when journalists asked what the bad news might be and are there going to be tax raises, she said, you'll have to wait. Is that authentic?
Yes, in that she's pitch rolling ahead of the budget, which is going to be a challenging budget, to put it mildly. And what you will get from Rachel, and I think she did say this yesterday in her speech, is she's not always going to be making popular decisions, but she's making decisions that she believes is right, and she'll make the case for
But what's the point of
those
saying that when
decisions at the budget.
you're not even telling us what the decisions are, and you're not even spelling out what is popular and what isn't popular? I mean, we know with Mamdani, I know it's early days, but we know he's going to freeze rents, and we know a lot of people who have money in the city are terrified of him, right? And he's going, that's fine, I don't care. She's not doing that. You're not doing that as a government.
Well, no, not least because in terms of our economy and the trying to get growth back into our economy and make sure that we can invest in progressive ends in our country, far from wanting to frighten off investment and business, we want to encourage it. And so the discipline we've shown, the stability we're trying to bring back to the British economy is crucial.
He could have said, we cannot risk, the capitalist beacon that is New York City. He didn't say that. And look what the investors are saying now. They're saying, actually, we'll try and work with him because it seems he's really popular.
Well, it's quite a different platform being mayor of a big city compared to being with, the finance minister of a G7 country, which is what Rachel's doing. So it's a different platform. It's a different set of challenges, and I think Mamdani, he has positioned himself well to appeal to a broad base of support, to win an election where he was the rank outsider from the beginning. Of course, he's also now got to deliver. Back to your challenge on us, which I don't want to duck that question. Certainly not going to personalise criticism of colleagues, but just to, I think, reflect on what could be a danger for Labour as we go further into this Parliament. It is really important that we don't allow ourselves to be positioned as or perceived as the defenders of a broken status quo. And the challenge as you go further into a Parliament, and look at the breadth of challenge, I mean, look at the news today, another prisoner manhunt underway. These are all symptoms and proof points for a country that was fundamentally, I almost dropped the F-bomb, by our predecessors. We came into a broken economy, broken public services, and broken trust in politics itself. And we've got to continue to be the insurgents. We've got to carry on being.
That's just blaming the other people.
No, quite the opposite. It's really important. We came in to be change, and to drive change, to deliver change. So it's really important we keep that insurgency and do not allow ourselves to own Conservative failure.
No,
Our responsibility is to clean up the mess, and we'll do that. But that's where I think we've just got to be a bit careful as we go further into this Parliament and our incumbency begins to build.
Okay, you talked about the kind of need to, the discipline of Mamdani's messaging, the digital content, the social media content, how good it was, and how he understood the attention economy of you need to be communicating the whole time and giving a clear message. Are you, as a government, doing well enough on that now?
Well, objectively, no. We need to do better when it comes to getting our message across about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the values that are driving our decisions. I thought one of the real strengths of Labour's conference, which was the last time I spoke to you guys, I felt that whether it was Keir's speech and the degree to which, you could tell when he talked about apprenticeships, when he talked about racism in our society, when he talked about the dignity of work, you could tell these were things that he really cared about and hit close to home.
But when I look at, but let me say this. So
but we've got to sustain that beyond party conferences.
But you talk about authenticity as well. When I look at Keir Starmer's account on social media and I see the clips on Instagram or whatever it happens to be, it's produced, it's kind of, there's nothing that feels, I'm really getting a real sense of the person and the passion and what drives. I'm getting a communication from number 10 Downing Street. Now, whatever the faults of Donald Trump, you think when you look at Truth Social, I'm getting the real guy, he's telling me what he thinks. And with Mamdani, I'm getting the real guy, he's telling me what he thinks.
I'd absolutely take on the chin the challenge that on some of our social media channels, there are too many images of government buildings and not enough images of not just the Prime Minister, but all of us out and about, kind of talking to people, with people, whether in on public service front lines or talking to people in communities. And the what I find personally irritating about that is when the Prime Minister is in those settings. Even now as Prime Minister, he used to do loads of this as Labour leader, but even now as Prime Minister, with all the status that brings, I see someone who is really comfortable around people, enjoys their company, and you can tell through the quality of those interactions really cares. And it's the responsibility of the government, the party, to take that and amplify it so that everyone else gets to see a window into what maybe I get to see more of because I serve in the Prime Minister's cabinet and I work closely with him.
I don't think anyone doubts that Keir Starmer cares. I think that's really clear. And I want to get away from social media per se. But if you asked what he thought, if you asked what he felt, how can the same man that talked about the island of strangers then be the same man that stands up and says, there is too much racism? He took on Elon Musk at the beginning of the year. Do you remember? There was a really powerful moment where he took on Elon Musk and said, we're not going to have this interference. And that was a moment where I think kind of the country as one cheered. It was like, oh, great. That's what a fight looks like. But I don't think we get very much of that. We don't always understand. Does he fear Farage? Does he, this comment that was told to me, Farage is right, don't vote for him. That sort of seems to go to the heart of quite often what Starmer says. He's right about a lot of this stuff, but don't vote for him.
Well, in some ways, the island of strangers challenge is the easiest one to answer because he's addressed it himself. One of those speeches was authentically Keir, one wasn't. The one that was authentically Keir was the Labour Party conference speech, and the authentic Keir is a strong and committed anti-racist. Islands of Strangers, he set out the context for what went wrong with that speech. I was there sat in the front row thinking, well, firstly, I didn't like the language, and I knew what was intended, or I assumed what was intended, and I knew how it'd be heard by people I represent and people in my constituency. Did you
talk to him afterwards about it? Did you say, what the was that?
No, I didn't use that language, but I did say to him when he'd given his interviews that this makes a lot of sense to me because this is the Keir I know and I'm proud to work for. And I think that when it comes to the climate in our country at the moment, this is why today I was talking to the Guardian with the chief exec of the NHS. One of the reasons why I've been so outspoken on this issue is because it is extremely close to home, and I have been shocked by conversations I've had with people I represent in Parliament, not just about their fear of racism, but their actual experience of it in recent weeks.
You talk
the
about
kind
NHS
of
staff.
70s,
Yeah.
80s style racism. Well, that was my constituents. After I did Laura Koonsberg and called out Sarah Pochin and Reform UK's abject failure on this issue, I have been inundated with people who work in health and social care saying, this is what's happening with us. This is the way our patients are behaving. This is how I'm being made to feel at work. And I've got a responsibility as the leader of that system to challenge it and to give my full-throated backing to NHS staff who say, you've got the right to access the NHS, but that's not a right to abuse us. If you don't want us to treat you, you can go somewhere else. And they've got my full support in taking that
Wes,
stance.
why do you think it has come back? Because I'm struck by it as well. And, kind of words I heard in a playground at school in the 1970s when I was at school, you just do not hear anymore. And yet it's coming back. What is the explanation of that?
I think it's complicated. I do think that the sort of economic conditions that we've got, not just in this country, but across Europe, create the fertile ground for
But it's like it's become
division.
permissible again to say unspeakable,
and
horrible things.
And that's what I think we all have a responsibility to take this on. We all have a responsibility not to be bystanders to it. And that's not just about the response of the state and the policing of the law. That is about what we see, what we hear in our own lives, and whether we've got the courage to challenge it. And the economic conditions in this country are such that there is fertile ground for people who want to exploit problems rather than address them, to say this isn't the fault of previous governments, this isn't the fault of a broken economy, this is the fault of those people over there who don't look like you or don't worship the same God as you. And that is this is a tale as old as time, and we have seen this movie before, and therefore we have to go after it rapidly and robustly to make sure we do not see the return of socially acceptable racism that leaves people in my community and others around the country questioning whether this is a safe place for them. We're seeing that on so many fronts. I had one of my local rabbis come to see me last Friday about, and speaking for many of my Jewish constituents who are questioning whether this, one of the most diverse cities on earth, is a safe place for Jews to live, when my constituency has always been a home for Jewish people. So this is manifesting itself in all sorts of different ways, and our responsibility as a government and as leaders of the country is to bring people together in common cause and to attack problems at root cause and not allow the scapegoating of the other. And that's one of the things I think we take from the success in New York, which is, I believe this to the kind of core of my soul, hope is more powerful than hate.
I want to go
what we
back
have
to that
go after.
question. Not just Mamdani, but also Gavin Newsom have used not just hope, but, I'm going to go to the other bit of the Obama phrase, audacity. They've been quite audacious in what they're doing and what they're asking for. So in that spirit, Wes, I'm going to go back to your first thought, which is about authenticity. And if I said to you, Wes Streeting, do you think you would make a good Prime Minister? What would your authentic self say to that right now, today?
I say I'm very happy being Health Secretary. Thank you very much.
Is that your authentic answer?
Yep.
Really?
Yeah, because to an extent as well, and I sort of get a bit fed up of this, where it's never kind of wise to attack the interviewer when you're on their program, but you kind of know where that kind of that line of questioning goes. And you always have a choice. Am I giving an answer that helps my own side and what we want to achieve, or an answer that kind of rocks the boat and breeds instability? And we frankly saw a bit too much of that in the run-up to the Labour Party conference. Prime Minister's got a bloody difficult job, and he needs his team rowing in behind him, not rocking the boat.
But is your answer
and I've always been
fight a bit
team
harder?
player.
Is your answer
We've
get
all
out
got,
there a bit more?
all of us do. All of us have to do that. And look, it's I was thinking about this the other days. We've been in government, not even a year and a half yet. And you look at the challenges we're up against in the NHS, in the criminal justice system, in the economy and so on. The sort of list is endless. Now, sometimes I think we make the mistake of talking a bit too much about tough choices, difficult choices. I mean, as if it's a burden rather than a privilege and something we asked the public to give us permission to do. And honestly, for all the challenges, I've loved every minute of being in government and of having the ability to change things for the better for our country. At the same time, though, we do have to kind of also remind people just like this, the number of fronts we're fighting on at the moment.
Is one of the ways to deal with this that I sometimes feel listening to government communication where you can see the cogs whirring, where we've got to triangulate between the threat posed to us by reform and the threat posed to us by green, and we try and steer a neutral path, and we just kind of get the messaging so that it's just doesn't upset the progressive side, but it doesn't alienate those voters on the right maybe who voted for us at the last election. And it just sounds so laboured. Why don't you just tell us?
No, look, if you're stuck in neutral, you're not going anywhere by definition.
And do you think there's been too much of that?
I think the danger for Labour, I actually thought Lucy Powell set this out very convincingly in her deputy leadership pitch, was to recognise that at the moment we've got challenges to both our left and to our right. And what you can't do is sort of, to continue the driving metaphor, is just swerve around from one side of the road to the other or remain stuck in neutral. We have to set out our own stall based on our own values. I do think that we've got a lot in common with people to our progressive left. In fact, I'd argue throughout its history, the Labour Party has been a progressive alliance of different centre-left democratic socialist traditions. We've never been a revolutionary socialist party. People have tried over more than 100 years, but we've always been a mainstream centre-left party, but with different left traditions. And I think we're stronger for that. What we can't do in taking on reform is to try and out-reform in the language we use or the policies we put forward. Now, that doesn't mean when you're taking on an issue like immigration, you got to do it in a values-driven sense. And my centre-left values cause me no discomfort in saying levels of net migration in this country are too high. And I say that because I think, A, objectively they are. B, we're over-reliant on recruitment of health and care workers, for example, from many countries who are on the World Health Organization's red list because they've got such severe shortages. So I think it's immoral that we're poaching. That's how I approach that question and think, well, let's invest in the skills and the training of our own people. Let's make sure that we've got a health and care system that stands on its own feet rather than poaches from other countries. That's a very different centre-left authentic argument for reducing net migration compared with, Katie Lamb, who, people are writing up as a future of the Conservative Party. Well, God help us if she is, because, cultural coherence was her argument. Now, that is a extremely different argument than the one I would use. It's almost Enoch Powell-esque in its kind of rhetoric. And why is she doing that? Not because I think the Conservative Party is now a kind of further to the right party than they've traditionally been, but just because I think she's looking at reform and trying to ape them. So, look, and that brings me back to the central point, really. Authenticity is the most important currency. We've got to remain authentic. We've got to do our politics as a Labour government in a values-driven way. And we've got to make sure that throughout the course of this Parliament and at the next general election, that we continue to fight as the insurgents, as the change makers, as the challengers of a broken status quo.
Look, you are expressing this with enormous articulacy and a good deal of charisma. You push back very hard on Emily's question about being a future Prime Minister, but you do sound a bit like a future Prime Minister. Does the comments like that annoy you, flatter you?
I think at this stage I find it annoying because, I think that the sort of speculation and the sort of, politics as who's up, who's down, that kind of personality-based politics, I don't think is kind of serious set against the challenges that we've got.
But are you articulating this because no one else is?
And first I say being Prime Minister, or in fact, forget the Prime Minister bit for a minute. Being leader of the Labour Party is a bit like being the England manager. Everyone thinks they could do a better job. And it's an extremely difficult job. I think the Prime Minister has got the toughest job of all of us. I sit around the cabinet table and think on any given day who's got the toughest job. I mean, David Lammy, the Justice Secretary's got the toughest job today, I would argue, with this prisoner release. But tomorrow it could be me. In fact, there's an equally serious story being covered on the front of the New Statesman today and by Channel 4 about the maternity scandal. Bridget Phillipson has an enormous challenge to deal with in terms of special educational needs and support for disabled children. So right across the board, we have these challenges. And so, the one thing I'm always mindful of is the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, they carry all of those challenges on their shoulders because they have to worry about all of those things. In Keir's case, how am I leading my country and my government to deal with it? In Rachel's case, how are we going to make sure we pay for it, and how are we going to make sure that we get growth back into the economy that creates happiness, security and opportunity for everyone? These are the things that are driving us. It's not easy. The choices we make aren't always going to be popular. The important thing is that we make choices that, down the line we will be able to look back on saying, I'm proud of those choices. They were values-driven choices and they proved to be the right choices for the country.
I know you don't want to be in the business of criticising a cabinet colleague, but I'm just struck by the difference between, I heard Bridget Phillipson on Sky this morning when she was asked about the New York mayoral election, and she said, I haven't really been following it. Must have fought a good campaign. Didn't want to talk about the politics of it. Now,
well, there's a very good chance she was telling the truth. Not least because throughout most of Mamdani's campaign, as it was getting quite exciting from my perspective, she was out touring the country with her own deputy leadership campaign. So, there's an argument we spend a bit too much time on American politics. So I think we can forgive Bridget for not following the ins and outs of the New York mayoral race.
But the argument I'm making is that you are here wanting to make these arguments. And I don't see anyone else doing that.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's a fair characterisation of the Labour government and my cabinet colleagues who are out making quite punchy arguments across the board. I mean, Steve Reed was marauding around Labour conference with his sort of Build Baby Build hats on, taking on sort of the blockers and what is, let's be honest, not always a straightforward and easy argument to make in green and pleasant England. So, I think if I were to sort of go through the cabinet, I could kind of point to battles that people are taking on, fights that people are taking on, the way in which they're challenging the status quo that we inherited. Do we need to tell that story better as a team? 100%. Do we need to have a better kind of, mobilising argument for this Labour government? Of course we do. And do I sort of look around the cabinet table at a group of people who are up for the challenge and taking on the enormous scale of the challenge we inherited? Absolutely. And I don't want to give too much away and steal a colleague's thunder because I'll be in real trouble then. All I'll say is, and I don't often talk about cabinet discussions. This week I was at the cabinet and Lisa Nandy was setting out how she's approaching the National Youth Strategy. And first time we've had one in this country for donkey's years. She's got young people involved and in particular the sorts of voices that don't always get heard. And it was genuinely inspiring. Quite challenging in terms of the scale of the challenge in childhood and some of the findings of the research her department's been doing about what it's like to be a young person in this country today, and some of the issues around loneliness and well-being and how young people feel about their place in the world, which she'll set out when she launches the strategy. But genuinely exciting and inspiring in terms of that vision, set alongside what Bridget Phillipson's been talking about today in the curriculum review. High standards and going bigger on science, given, that's the way the world is going, but also the importance of creativity in the curriculum and making sure there's a rich offer around extracurricular activities, all that enrichment stuff that, frankly, people like me and Bridget were much less likely to experience growing up without the wise investment of the British taxpayer. And in some ways, that's probably the most untold story of this cabinet and this government so far. It is the most working class cabinet in history. It does drive our values and our outlook. It's why, I froze prescription charges and have protected exemptions for people who do not pay for their prescriptions, because I know what it's like when you don't have a lot of money, and I've seen it growing up and my family still experience that. It's why Bridget is going so hard on child poverty and the measures that we need to take to lift more kids out of poverty, in addition to the 100,000 that her free school meals policy will have already done. So, that's a story we need to tell. And I think that is how we will rebuild our broken economy, broken public services, and maybe most importantly of all, broken trust in politics.
Wes Streeting, thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We've talked predominantly about what Zohran Mamdani has done to electrify the politics of New York City. But as I said at the beginning, there were plenty of other races going on across America last night, and there have been some really interesting victories and moves from the Democrats. And we talk about all those at length in much more granular detail on the newsagents USA. We look at Gavin Newsom in California, we look at what's happening in Virginia and New Jersey, and ask bigger questions about how the Democrats are taking that fight to Trump.
To misquote Mark Twain, reports of the Democratic Party's death are much exaggerated. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.